Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Battle here, and today we have another Alberta forecast. Now, there's not going to be an election in Alberta anytime soon. Danielle Smith just won a majority government, but we are doing. I'm rolling out some interim updates for different provinces just so we can see how things are evolving over time. I'm not going to do a regular upload for all the provinces, like a fixed schedule, but when there's polls and when there's things to say, I will be doing updates, and one of the first ones here is Alberta, just because I find this particularly interesting. But before we get into the rest of the video, I would just like to once again shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give me, and if you want to support the channel, by all means go below and join as a member. That is the best way to support me, but if you can't afford to do that, I understand, and by all means, like, share, subscribe, comment below. All your regular YouTube things, they do help quite a bit. So, with that, let us get into the rest of the video. So we just had the Alberta provincial election in May. And Danielle Smith won a decisive victory. Now, some people have been kind of poo-pooing and saying it wasn't that decisive or wasn't that big of a victory. But really it was. Now, the reason why some people are saying it wasn't particularly decisive is that a bunch of seats in Calgary were very close. And actually, if we see this map right here, there still are a lot of seats in Calgary that are quite close. But the closeness of seats in Calgary is kind of secondary. Because the main reason why we should see the May election as decisive is that Smith won a decisive majority of the vote. She got 52.63% of votes, an 8.5 point lead over the NDP. And this is a point when the NDP has had their best performance ever in Alberta, the best performance of the combined left ever in Alberta. And the UCP actually had a pretty bad performance. They only had about 930,000 votes, which is well below the Conservative average in the province, which would be closer to the 2019 result with about 120-ish thousand voters. So that was a decisive win. And one of the things that needs to be understood going forward in Alberta, especially when we start looking at federal numbers, when we start looking at federal events, when we start looking at how things are evolving in Canada in general, there's a lot of leg room for the UCP to gain ground from here. And the other important thing to consider is the polls are not usually very favorable or accurate to the UCP. Just in the last election, I'll just bring it up here. We see these polls during the campaign period, and you'll notice, other than this Janet Brown poll, every single pollster lagged UCP vote share significantly. Most pollsters, other than Janet Brown in Forum, overestimated the NDP position quite significantly. Now, my model does take this into account, and it does do interpolative math, but it only does so well because if there's only certain polls out, then it's only going to say certain things. At the time of this upload, the most recent poll in Alberta has been on the wakes and in regards to the Alberta Pension Plan program, or referendum that Smith is going to hold. Now, that's quite a divisive referendum, and it's actually not particularly popular depending on how the polls get. The only polls we have say it's not particularly popular. Just going to bring it up over here. One second. So only 32% of Alberta supports the APP, and 50% currently disapproves of it. 18% are undecided. Now, this doesn't really seem like great numbers considering the APP is a big piece of potential legislation that Smith's government is trying to do. This seems kind of like a setup for failure. Now, I will contend here that that's actually on purpose, so I will get into that in a moment. So, in the wake of this currently not particularly popular referendum, we would expect the UCP numbers to be suppressed a little bit. So, this update here might be even a slightly underestimation of where the UCP actually is. But if so, we're not looking at much of a difference. The UCP is really only down about 2-ish points, and the NDP are only up about a half point. But if we go into regionals, things are a bit better for the UCP. So before I get into this, I will just clarify. When I did Alberta coverage in the summer and in the last fall, I was using Calgary as just the city. So if I pull this up here. So this would be just the city of Calgary. I'm now adding the CMA to it because most polls are by CMA. So that's including both Adries, Chestermere, and Highwood as part of Calgary for the purposes of this model. That is where we get these PV numbers from. So from here, we see in Calgary itself, the NDP are down 0.9, UCP are up 1.6. Or down 1.6, sorry. But the big thing, and this is where this is actually quite good for the UCP, is the NDP are actually up 0.5 in Edmonton and 2.4 in the rest of Alberta, and the UCP is down 2.2 in Edmonton and down 3.7 in the rest of Alberta. So why are those numbers good? Well, right now in Alberta, the election is entirely about central Calgary and the outskirts of Edmonton. If the NDP are doing better in rural Alberta, pretty much every single riding is nearly 30-point margins for the UCP, and better in Edmonton, which as we see here, they dominate, that's not actually very useful vote share gains for winning seats. So even though they're down a little bit in popular vote here, because of the efficiencies of this distribution of vote changes, they're likely going to eke out some ridings in Calgary that they just narrowly lost last election. And it's also worth noting too, now it's hard to say who this benefits the most, but it's looking like, or these numbers are not entirely accurate, I should say, because I currently have OWR, which is the other right-wing parties, the Alberta Party, Liberal Party, Greens, and other, as having full slates of candidates, because I don't know where they're going to run candidates, and I don't know how it's going to affect each individual riding, so I'm just assuming they're going everywhere. In reality, they're not going to be everywhere. There's going to be candidates missing. And since there's going to be candidates missing, the two main parties, the UCP and NDP's vote share, are actually suppressed right now. This is, generally speaking, actually quite good for the UCP. Because a lot of this is actually in rural Alberta, as we see here, 2.6, 1.9, 0.9, 0.8. If they're not running full slates here, this is mostly going to benefit the UCP in rural Alberta. And if we see the same thing happen in Edmonton, it's not really going to hurt the UCP. Calgary, it's a bit trickier, but considering other right is generally speaking bigger than Liberals, and the Alberta Party and Green voters are more hard to call. Greens are more likely to actually run a lot of candidates right now. So, generally speaking, the third party is probably edged towards the UCP. And there's other big things that the UCP does have to count on. First off, we go back to these numbers. This number is probably not accurate. As we saw in the last election, there was a 20-point miss in rural Alberta in raw polling. Likely, rural Alberta is still going to be missed by maybe not that bad as egregious of a margin, but still likely going to be missed by a significant margin, which means that the UCP vote share is actually likely even higher than this model forecasts, and the NDPs are even lower. But I can only correct that so far. So now, you may be asking yourselves, what was this about the Alberta pension plan possibly being intentionally failed? Well, my dear viewer, the reason I say that is it, in practice and in essence, the reason why Smith and the UCP are having a referendum on the Alberta pension plan is because there is growing separatist sentiment in Alberta. And one of the first things separatists want to do is to pull away from national programs to make it easier for the area, the region, to separate. That is literally the only reason they want to do the Alberta pension plan. Yes, there's certain economic benefits in the short term for Albertans. Sure. But the reason for the plan from the people who really want it is because it will give them more leeway and more ease to leave Canada. But it's not very popular. So if Smith actually supported it fully, she would have just done it unilaterally in law. She would have just done it. She has not just done it. She's putting it to referendum. And as we see in the polling, it's not very popular and it's likely going to fail referendum. So why would you put something to referendum that you don't actually want to pass, but you want to say, you want to stump on? Well, because you don't actually want it to pass. And referendums are a terrible way to pass new policy. Why is that, you might think yourselves? Well, in essence, what a referendum is it's asking all of the lay people, sorry about that, hit the microphone, across the province, do you want to change something? Something really big, something really drastic. And usually, voters don't want to change things. Voters like the average lay voter, the person, not the wonks, not the people probably watching this podcast. Some of them might. But most voters don't usually care that much about policy. They don't care that much about how the government works, what their money's doing, as long as their health care is okay, their education for their kids is fine, their taxes are reasonable, and their economy's healthy. They don't care about anything else. They don't care how the pension is managed, so long as the pension is managed well. So in the case of this, where they're talking about changing how the pension is managed, most lay voters don't care. They don't care who manages the pension. Is it the feds? Is it the province? They don't care. They just want their pension to be managed well. And if voters don't think it's currently being managed poorly, which by all accounts, I don't think anyone per se thinks the CPP is being managed poorly as an individual fund. There's some people debating whether it's has too many unfunded liabilities or whether it's fair. But fairness is not how it's run. Very few people are contending it's run poorly, as in it's getting notably bad rates of returns for its purpose, or notably mismanaged. Since nobody thinks that, that's not on voters' minds. So when you put the CPP/APP to referendum, you should expect it to return status quo, because people don't care how it's actually managed in specifics. Most people don't actually even know how it works in specifics. Very, very few people even know, and of those, even fewer actually really care. And that's true with most government policy. Very few voters care how things technically work. They don't really care which level of government builds houses. They don't care which level of government manages hospitals. They don't care what their tax rates are, per se. What they care about is that the services they get from the government are reasonable for what they're paying. If they pay a lot of taxes but they get really good services, they don't care. If they feel like they're paying more taxes than they get in services, they get angry. But if you could go in an election and say, we're going to reduce your taxes but keep your services, they'll vote for that because no one, like, that's great. We can pay less money and get more services. That's great. But if you have a referendum about, should we change how this pension structure is managed, and people don't think the pensions are being poorly managed, they're not going to vote for it. You can make arguments and say points that the Smith and the pro-APP groups are saying about we can reduce pension rates for Albertans. That's great, and that will swing some people, but most people don't think about that. Or they don't really see how that's going to affect them. Because they don't think about it. It's not because they're too dumb, not because they don't have the capacity to. They just don't spend the time or energy to learn. They have too many things to do in their life, better things to do than speculate about what a pension is, how a pension is going to work, etc., etc. The unrealized gains of potentially tax savings are pretty small relative to the effort someone needs to do to understand what that means in practice. So, you might ask yourselves, okay, it's pretty clear that this is likely going to fail based on just the intrinsic natures of how referendums work. But why would Smith want to do that? Why would she have a major piece of government legislation that is almost doomed to fail at referendum? Well, the short answer is she wants it to fail. Why does she want it to fail? Well, fundamentally, the faction in the UCP who wants Alberta independence does not have support of the elite in Alberta, the upper class, the leadership class. They will wink and nod at them because they're important to secure leadership nominations. They're important votes in the election. But they don't really want Alberta to declare independence. They don't want to separate from Canada. So one of the best ways to do that is to table referendums that you know are doomed to fail. Because then you can just wash your hands and say, oh, Albertans don't want it. Now, those astute viewers may realize, wait, isn't this what David Cameron was thinking with the Brexit referendum? Didn't that go really poorly for him? Yes. Yes, it did. And that's not saying that this could not go terrible for Smith, and this, assuming I am correct and she actually wants to fail. But the reason why I think this is going to be different than it is for Brexit is the people voting for Brexit were voting for Brexit not for esoteric sovereignty reasons or economics or something like that. They were voting for Brexit because the Brexit campaign clearly and cleanly sold it as a way to control immigration. And voters in the UK today, 2015, even before 2015, wanted to reduce immigration. So it was billed to voters by the Leave campaign as a means to reduce immigration. Now, unlike how a pension is managed, saying vote Leave, and then we will have fewer immigrants is actually quite easy to pitch and understand for lay voters. Because it's not a complicated concept. We have immigrants because we are in the EU. If we leave the EU, we will get fewer immigrants. And technically speaking, the Leave campaign was correct. There are fewer European immigrants to the United Kingdom today than there was in 2014. The corollary is the Conservative Party has allowed immigration from the rest of the world to increase, so immigration is actually higher now. So, in a sense, the Conservative Party just lied to their voters blatantly, and that's why you see them doing terribly in the polls right now. But that said, even Brexit was quite close for something that was a very big and dear issue. And the other big factor for Brexit is a well-established, generally speaking, well-liked leader that is part of the British political elite, the British upper class, was pro-Brexit, and that's Nigel Farage, the leader of UKIP, the leader of the largest party in the European Assembly delegation from the UK, the leader of the Leave campaign. There is no such prominent, high-profile, well-liked person in Alberta championing the Alberta pension plan. You might argue Smith herself is that, and Smith isn't disliked. She's, I think, around 44% approval, depending. Let's see. I think the second last Ledger poll had some approval numbers in it. Let's take a look. Yeah, she has about 44% approve, but she also has 44% disapprove. It's not actually that bad, by any means. And it actually does put her vote ceiling around 54%, and she's about halfway there, which, again, makes sense. That's kind of how you should expect conservatives to go. She is roughly where we should expect her to be. And similarly, note least 43% is actually roughly where we expect the NDP to be, because the left tends to get around the approval rating of their leader. The right tends to exceed it. But that's for your future video if you care. So all this boils down to the Alberta pension plan is either a daring gamble that is probably going to fail, or it's intentionally set up for failure. I cannot confirm nor deny either one. Smith has not told me anything that anyone else doesn't know. In fact, she's never talked to me. Though, I mean, if her office wants to tell me these details, I mean, feel free, but she's probably not going to do that. So then, you might have a reasonable thought from this. So she's going to create a referendum that's not for an issue that most Albertans don't want. It's kind of divisive. It's going to fail. Isn't it going to look bad on her? Well, yes, in the short term. Think about when this referendum is going to happen. It's going to be most of the way through the first year. I don't remember the exact date, but she's going to be about like a year and a bit into the term. I think it's next May, maybe? Not 100% certain. Correct me in the comments. I didn't think to look it up before this video. It's not that important. The main thing is it's not that close to an election time, so most people aren't paying too much attention. And since it's in the middle of the term, she has 2-3 years left to do things to change people's minds. 2 or 3 years to manage the economy well. 2 or 3 years to spend money on things people want. 2 or 3 years to do legislation people want. She has time to rebound from it. It will likely be completely irrelevant by election day. And even if the NDP tries to say, oh, the UCP spent so much money on a referendum, that usually doesn't go very well because people like being consulted. It's usually not a good idea to actually consult people, but people like being consulted when you do. And when I say good idea, I mean politically speaking. You're very likely not going to get the thing you want passed if you consult people. But people want to be consulted, so they like it when you consult them, even though consulting them is usually a bad idea. So where does this put Alberta in? Well, unsurprisingly, Smith is in a very good position. She's pretty set. Barring her making any big mistakes or piloting this referendum really badly, or if in some event this referendum succeeds, but then she completely fails at implementation and it turns into a pension disaster, barring any of that, she should be just fine going forward. And the corollary here is there isn't much room or much path for Notley. Assuming she even stays on. There is some debate on that, but so far, as far as I'm aware, she's not said she's going to resign. But there is not much clear path for the NDP. 777,000 votes that they got last election is pretty much near the absolute ceiling of the left in Alberta. Even when you consider all the possible splinter parties, there isn't much more to gather. Whereas the UCP are quite low, and one of the reasons they were quite low in 2023 is Smith was an unknown quantity. She's had a bad reputation in a lot of circles. But by 27, assuming she pilots things well, the economy does fine, she will pretty much discard that reputation. And a lot of right-wing people who are apprehensive about Smith will vote. And we know there's lots of them who are apprehensive about Smith because the UCP turnout collapsed. And the UCP turnout, even under Kenny, who had a better reputation than Smith does, at least in 2019 he had a better reputation, Kenny underperformed the federal party, the Conservatives. So it stands to reason that as long as the UCP manages the government well, they don't have any big scandals, they don't do anything stupid, they just manage it well, they should gain ground going to the next election because the last one was near their floor. Now, the corollary to this is some people are saying without Trudeau in office, because it looks like Poilievre's going to win, there is no clear path or option for Smith because her last campaign was very much anti-Trudeau. The problem with that, though, is if Poilievre gets in, let's say, 25, and then between federal legislation and provincial action, there can be a resource and or oil boom because of changing regulations, possibly pipelines being constructed or approved. That should carry the UCP to re-election regardless of what happens. And there's plenty of path for that. Sure, Smith largely got elected by being competitive with Trudeau, but being combative with the feds is not the only thing that needs to happen. The UCP can work with the feds to get more mining, to do more oil, to export oil at higher prices, because the main reason why we want pipeline capacity isn't necessarily to export the oil, which, yes, that is the goal, but the main thing is if we have more markets we can export oil to, the higher the dollar value of oil we can sell. Last I've checked on this, if we sell oil to the US, because it's the only market we can train to, and without pipelines, you can't really get them to the coast for tanker ships. But selling oil to the US is usually around 80 cents to the dollar. If we can sell oil to the UK or Europe for $1 to the dollar, that's a substantial increase in royalties, a substantial increase in just incomes, taxes, etc. It could be a bona fide mini oil boom. And there's plenty of capacity for this, especially as if the West continues to try to boycott Russian oil to the best of our abilities, or other similar countries that have lots of oil reserves. And just in general, there is always more uses for more oil. People will always find a way to use it. If it's cheap enough, then they will find up something else to spend it on. That's how innovation works. So this puts the picture for the UCP quite well right now. Smith hasn't done anything particularly onerous or particularly damaging. Her previous issues have usually been things she said or things putting her foot in her mouth. But since the election, she's done it a lot better. She has more control. She has better phrasing. So she's not really putting her foot in her mouth in the same way she was in her first few months in office. And we should expect that, because in her first few months, she was very likely still in radio jockey mode, which is what her job was before. And if you're doing that, being a bit provocative is necessary. It's good for your show. As premier, that's not very good. And that's actually a doubly good thing for Smith. Because the NDP campaign in 23 was basically entirely about how Smith was a radical. Smith said stupid things. Smith puts her foot in her mouth. She's a clown. Whatever. What do you want to say? So she has 4 years of government where she's not making a fool of herself. She's not doing anything particularly radical. It's just going to make the NDP campaign look silly. And if the economy is doing well and there's a resource boom, which by all accounts is in the cards, it'll be very difficult for the NDP to do anything. Now, by all means, I'm not saying 27 is a shoo-in. Things can happen. Smith could make a mistake. Maybe there could be another internal coup, because the UCP and the Conservatives, in general in Alberta, love cooing themselves. But barring something like that, or barring a just generalized recession hitting Alberta, which seems unlikely considering the price of oil right now, but barring something really bad or really dumb, the UCP is in a good position. And we should expect that. And it seems they're going to spend some of their political capital from their good position, from their big election win, on trying to kill the Alberta separatist movement. Or at least suppress it. It'll be interesting going forward to see how that is. And it'll also be interesting going forward, especially next year and the year after, what Smith does with her political capital. So far, we just have the APP, but she definitely has more political capital than that. We should expect something else. In the works in the background, there's some suggestion that she might copy Blaine Higgs' Policy 713 revision, or a very similar derivative of that. There might be other things she could do, and that's the thing to really watch out for, because not that these are likely going to hurt her, because anything you do in the middle of your term, as long as it doesn't directly harm people, directly harm your voters, is likely not going to be a big deal. And it might actually help her, to be fair. But these are the interesting things to look for. The day-to-day polls and the day-to-day swinging in them, it's not much. Not really that consideration. But just on that one final note, I will just bring up this one ledger poll just to talk about it. So here we go. So there was some talk about this poll because it has, oh no, the NDP are in first there, 47 to 46. Guys, let's be fair here. Ledger has the NDP at 39% of the rest of Alberta, and the UCP at 56%. Yeah, there's definitely been a 22 percentage point swing in the rest of Alberta since, what, May? No, there hasn't. That's really silly, and we should pretty much just ignore this poll. Now, I'm not ignoring this poll. I'm doing some math and stuff and using the cross tables. But this right here You got to be careful when you look at headlines and polls. Oh no, NDP plus 1 looks pretty scary. Look at the cross table. These regionals are impossible. They're not happening. So then you get some silly things pop up. So that's just the one thing to keep in mind. Not all polls are valid polls because of how the sampling works. I don't think Ledger did a bad job on purpose. I think they just got a bad sample. And the reason why they got a bad sample is the reason why every other pollster gets a bad sample. Apparently, polling rural areas is really hard. Now, in specific for Ledger, I don't think Ledger does a very good job in Alberta, period. I don't know what it is. I don't know how it is, but they always have the Conservatives federally lower in Alberta than any other pollster usually. So however their online panel works out, I don't think it represents Albertans very well. They usually miss Alberta by quite a bit. But that is really a topic for a different video. With that, I bid you adieu. And if you want to see more things like this, by all means comment below. Otherwise, just let me know what you think, and I will see you next week with something different.